Then we had this thing where Malcolm McLaren, I think he was in New York to buy overcoats, reputedly vintage overcoats, but he ended up managing the New York Dolls. He put them in red leather and had all sorts of communist symbols, because he reckoned the way to upset Americans was communist symbols. It didn't really work, but what it did do was it sort of formed a relationship between Johnny Thunders and Malcolm. And when he was getting the Anarchy tour together with the Clash and the Damned, I think the Damned only made a couple of dates before they were thrown off the bus, or the bus left without them, let's say. And so Malcolm rang up Lee, because he knew Lee was managing the Heartbreakers, which is where Johnny Thunders had moved to, and invited them over onto the Anarchy tour. And that really is the bridge between New York and London. Though previously what had happened in 1972, I think, in the Roundhouse in Camden, Lee Black Childers had been the creative director of a Warhol play called Pork, which had Wayne County and Cherry Vanilla in it. And Lee had got Angie Bowie to come and see it. And at that time, Bowie was very much a sort of hippie, if you like, hunky-dory, long hair, acoustic guitar. And Angie saw Pork, was blown away with it, got a husband to come. He got really excited. They ended up going out drinking and meeting up a lot with Cherry and with Lee and with Wayne. And what happened was they went to the States and they helped David create his Ziggy Stardust persona. In fact, the real story is, I think then David got a bit fed up with them and got his record company to actually put them into a hotel in LA with lots of drugs and drinks, so they didn't actually do the rest of the tour with him. But anyway, there was a link, because that helped the Ziggy Stardust image, which obviously became very big in the UK and in the States. But the real link was with the Anarchy tour, which was in 1976. And this was a tour which actually took place mostly in car parks, because we'd had the Bill Grundy show, which was a very early evening family show, 6:30 in the evening, and the Sex Pistols had been on it, and they swore a bit on the programme, which was outrageous in 1976, and all the tabloid newspapers in England talked about the filth and the fury and these terrible Sex Pistols. And so what happened, a lot of the local councils started to ban the gigs where the band actually was. One of, I think, the 4 gigs they actually did was in a place called Caerphilly, and there are no other pictures of the Sex Pistols in Caerphilly other than these ones by Lee Black Childers, which we found last year. So you can see the band performing. You can see Steve Jones there in the sort of very loose-knit tops, which Vivienne Westwood had made in old people's homes, actually, had people sitting there knitting them. I think people really underplayed Vivienne Westwood's role in punk, and the way she styled everything, and the way that actually the Sex, which was her and Malcolm's shop in the King's Road, became a bit like the factory. It's where people hung out, it's where the ideas came from, and it's indeed where the Sex Pistols were created. Glenn Matlock, I think, who's been over here talking to you as well, actually worked in the shop, along with Chrissy Hine and people like that. So that was really now, 1976, punk was really kicking off in London. This is a lovely picture of Jordan and Johnny. Again, this is a picture that we've rediscovered. And this is the most popular shot in the exhibition. Nobody knows who this little girl is, but she really makes it with this innocence. This is another Bob Gruen picture, and it's a fantastic one. I think they're flying to Luxembourg for a gig. But you know, it's like anything. Like Andy Warhol's factory has been glamorized a lot, in the same way the Anarchy tour has been glamorized. I always like Glenn Matlock, who actually says, my memory of the Anarchy tour is boredom. We spent most of the time waiting around hotels. We had no idea what was happening. I want to pull this one out as well. This is a picture of Susie Sue. It's 1976 as well. This is the first time she went up on stage and sang the Lord's Prayer. And she played with a little-known person, a guitarist called Sid Vicious, and another little-known person called Baroni, and Marco Baroni. And as Neil, her manager, says, Susie, who can't sing, Steve Severin, who can't play bass, Marco Baroni, who can't play guitar, and Sid Vicious, who can't play drums. They made a wonderful racket for 15 minutes. So that was the start of Susie. You must try and get Susie over, actually. She seems to be doing a lot more now. This is a great picture of Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood. This is Christmas 1976 in Caroline Coon's house. Caroline Coon was a journalist for NME, and she went on actually after Bernie Rhodes to manage the Clash. Obviously, during the punk times in London, you tended to either support the Clash or Sex Pistols. The Clash were very political. Bernie Rhodes, their manager, used to give them political tracts like homework to go home and read. Sex Pistols was much more about fashion, and it was much more about art. A lot of people in this time came out of the metropolitan art colleges, where a lot of working class people went to. People like Sid Vicious came out of there, Glenn Matlock, and it was, fairly, in a way, I suppose, appropriate. The first Sex Pistols gig was at St Martin's Lane, which is the sort of most famous art college in London. So, a lot of, looking back on it, a lot of Sex Pistols was a bit of an art installation. This is Malcolm was a very interesting character. This is Joe Corey, Malcolm's son, saying that Malcolm never went to school in his life. He went for one day, came back and told his grandmother they were all imbeciles, and he refused to go after that. But what Malcolm was the most amazing sort of publicist. He really understood how to get publicity. No one other than Malcolm, when you've sent the Sex Pistols on an American tour into cowboy country, would just say to Johnny Rotten just before he got up onto stage, just shout out, all cowboys are faggots before you start, which of course he did, and a few guns went off and a few cowboys got riled. But, of course there were reasons why the tour started in Atlanta in America, but really, I think deep down, Malcolm wanted to send the Sex Pistols into cowboy country. He wanted to send them to the most sort of lowest dive type venues. It was all rather planned, whereas the Clash, who were much smarter in a way, went to Boston, went to New York. They did I think 3 tours in 1 year. They were much more political. Their first tour was called Pearl Harbor, which is never a good thing to remind Americans about. And another one was called Take the Fifth. But they were from 77 through to 81. They were huge, getting huge in the East Coast. Whereas obviously the Sex Pistols tour was a complete mess, and obviously Sid was in the worst mess of all. Here's Sid halfway through the American tour, where he's been sort of cutting himself. The other person that came over on the Anarchy tour with the Heartbreakers was Nancy Spungen, who became Sid's girlfriend. Unfortunately, she was a very, very big junkie, and she's the one that really got Sid into heroin. And that was the problem on the Sex Pistols tour. Sid was really out of it most of the time. And of course, we all know that this ended by the time they got to New York, with Nancy being killed, Sid being blamed for that. Although in the book, we actually can reveal that it was someone different. It was a drug dealer in Hell's Kitchen. Sid ended up in jail, getting out of jail, and then overdosing and dying himself, which was the really sort of sad, tragic end to the Sex Pistols journey. Obviously on the way, they went to Rio and made the Rock and Roll Scandal, which is sort of Malcolm's way to completely rewrite the history of the Sex Pistols in his own way. But Sid ends up really being the icon, the Nirvana type just because he was only 21 when he died, and he had that great look. I knew Sid, he was a lovely boy. The only problem was he began to believe his own image, and then the drugs set in. This picture of Bob Gruens is in the National Portrait Gallery, in their permanent selection, and it's got the famous I'm a Mess badge on it. When the Sex Pistols went to America, it was great, big news. Walter Cronkite at CBS did a story about the imminent arrival of the Sex Pistols. He talked about them vomiting at airports, starting riots, bleeding. There were TV crews, everyone came to Memphis for the concert there. So they did create a huge sort of story in the States, but it wasn't always the best type. And that's why I would say, the Clash in a way were the ones that really succeeded America and won America. This is a fantastic picture of them at the top of the Rockefeller Center, looking out over the Empire State Building. another one by Bob Gruen. This is one of the best pictures I know of them actually on stage. This is in Boston. And, you know, there was no doubt that I think, you know, after Sex Pistols, it was the Clash that carried the baton of that spirit of 1976 in America. So it's a very short run through, pictures of the exhibition, quotes from my book, but I hope I've set a little bit of a context. You know, in many ways, New York and London were very alike in the 70s. London had a 3-day week, still had bomb sites, so did New York. You know, there was a lot of disaffected young people around, and out of that came this great thing called punk rock and punk, and I think its shadow is still with us today. It changed so many things, and there's always a saying actually that if your kids were hippies in the 60s, you didn't understand them. If your kids were punks in the 70s, you couldn't understand why they hated you so much. And that was probably the difference between the two decades.